All right, so I want to talk a bit about how to identify reliable sources of scientific information. When we want to double check a piece of scientific information, verify that something is really true, where do we go? How do we find information that we can rely on? So our goals here are to talk about how to break down a piece of media that's making scientific claims, then to evaluate the reliability of the sources that we're looking at, and to use reliable sources to cross-check information that we're seeing in one place with information from somewhere else. So the overall motivation here is for us to not get caught by misinformation, because it's easier than ever to spread misinformation. Whether it's deliberately, you're trying to put false information out there for some sort of agenda, or inadvertently, you come across information that isn't reliable, but you share it and propagate it anyway. And if you're an expert, often you can quickly and easily identify incorrect information when you see it. But nobody can be an expert in everything. You may have your one area of expertise that you easily recognize when people are saying things that aren't accurate. But there's a lot of things that you'll run into information about, and you can't be an expert in all of them. So we need to learn how to evaluate information in areas outside of our own expertise. And when we do this, we want to be extra careful when we're dealing with information that matches our own preconceptions, because it can be very easy to say, oh, I like what that's saying. It feels good. It matches what I already believe, so it must be true. Right? This must be true because it reinforces the things that I already think about the world. And that can be a very dangerous road to go down, because misinformation can slip right by you because it's the kind of thing that you already wanted to hear. So you want to be extra careful when information matches your preconceptions, since you're already going to be inclined to be kind of naturally skeptical of things that challenge your preconception. And I've fallen into this trap too. Even as the teacher here, telling you how to avoid misinformation, I've gotten caught up in it. And I've got an example there on the slide. So you may have seen this in the very early days of COVID-19. There were these stories going around about nature coming back because everybody was, working from home, staying off the streets and so forth. And one of those stories claimed that dolphins were being seen in the canals in Venice because the water had cleared up because people were, not out and about all the time anymore. And I shared that information because I was like, wow, this is really cool. But it's not true. There were no dolphins being spotted in Venice as a result of the coronavirus lockdowns. So when that happens, because it will eventually happen to all of us, no matter how careful you are, we're hit with so much information all the time. You're gonna make a mistake at some point. Then you correct yourself. You admit that you made a mistake. If you shared a post on social media, you could take it down or post some sort of a correction or let people know if you told them things. Oh, it turns out that wasn't actually true. And then you resolve to do better in the future. You resolve to be more careful about checking information that you believe or that you share going forward. So first, let's look at how to break down some piece of media. And so when I say media, I'm talking about, blog posts, newspaper articles, YouTube videos, TikTok videos, tweets, or X's or whatever they're called now. Anything that you see that is telling you some sort of information. Because we want to first determine, what is this source actually saying? Right? What are the actual claims being made here? Because first, a headline can be misleading. If you're coming across an article and you see some claim made in the headline of it, first thing to do is read the whole article. Headlines are often sensationalistic. They're usually not written by the person that wrote the article. They're written by some editor that's trying to get people to click on it. So they can miss out on a lot of important things. So read the whole article, make sure the headline isn't the only thing that you're relying on. If what you're seeing is a screenshot, those can be doctored. So if possible, try to check the original. Make sure that the original source is matching what you saw in that screenshot. And within a source, you're reading the text of an article or listening to the entire video or whatever, there are various rhetorical tricks that people can use to make it sound like they're saying something that they're not actually saying. Hinting and implying things that they're not actually standing behind, or, suggesting things that you can't really pin down what they actually mean, but it sounds bad or it sounds good. So you want to pin down what exactly are they actually saying, because you need that to be able to then verify if the thing they're saying is true. Then you also want to distinguish different types of claims that people might be making in a video or in an article or whatever. And three major types of claims that I think are useful to distinguish are natural or physical science claims, social science claims, and ethical or political claims. So natural or physical science claims are claims about how the non-human world works. Social science claims are claims about how human societies work. And then ethical or political claims are claims that are telling us what we should do or what we ought to do. So they're making a statement about what's right or wrong, or good or bad, or just or unjust. So in this video, we're going to focus on those physical or natural science claims, since that's the course that we're in. And when you're looking at one of those claims, first thing to do is you want to check the reliability of the piece of media that you're getting that claim from initially, right? The place you first saw that claim. You want to check whether that piece of media is itself a reliable source. Next, you want to see if you can find other reliable sources that either support or refute that claim. Right? Can you corroborate it by finding another reliable source that makes the same claim or a similar claim? Or do you find other reliable sources that are disagreeing, that are refuting the claim in that original piece of media? And as you're doing this, some important things to be asking about these scientific claims are, first, is it correct? Right? Is this a true statement of the facts? There's numbers in it, right? You can very easily say, well, are those numbers right? If it says 50% of blah, 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 is it actually 50%? Then you also want to ask, is it certain? You see a lot of things stated as if they are absolutely certain facts, when there's actually a lot of uncertainty about it. Almost everything that we say in science has some range of uncertainty around it. Some have big ranges of uncertainty, some have small ranges of uncertainty, but you don't want to treat a statement as if it is absolute definitive fact when it's our best estimate with wide error bars. So can we be certain about this claim? Then, is the claim complete? Is it telling you the whole story, or is it one little piece taken out of a larger set of claims? And finally, is it contextualized? Is your claim being put in the right context to understand what it actually means? How important is it? How does it fit in with all the other things that we might know about this topic? So in looking at the reliability of a source, some key questions to ask here are, first, who says so? Who is the person that's making this claim? So is the author of that source that you're getting the claim from themselves an expert in the topic that they're making this claim about? Or are they relying on other experts? So like a newspaper reporter is probably not an expert in most of the things they're reporting on, because they have to report on a wide variety of issues, but are they quoting actual experts for their information? And when you're asking whether someone's an expert, there's different kinds of expertise that might be relevant. So having a PhD gives you one kind of expertise, but personal experience can give you a different kind of expertise. So for example, if you're looking at some claims being made about an earthquake, somebody with a PhD in geology will have certain kinds of expertise. They understand how earthquakes work. They can explain, what kind of movement of tectonic plates might have been creating this earthquake, and how this earthquake compares to other quakes in history, and so forth, right? There's certain types of information that having a PhD in geology would allow you to assert. But if the claims are about what it was like to live through that earthquake, or how exactly the effects of that earthquake played out on a minute to minute basis during the earthquake, well, then somebody that lived through the quake, right, that has personal experience of it, has more expertise to be making those claims than a seismologist from a university thousands of miles away. So depending on the nature of the claim that you're evaluating, different kinds of expertise might be relevant. And a last thing to note as you're evaluating the people that are making claims is that everyone has some sort of bias. We can't simply sort people into biased and unbiased. Everybody has a perspective that they're bringing to the issue. Everybody has a set of interests. Everybody has a background that's going to shape what they know, what they say about whatever topics they're talking about. And so what's important is not to discard people as biased or validate them as unbiased, but rather to ask, are the biases that this person has ones that are going to affect whether I should believe the thing that they are saying in this particular case? So we need to be a little more nuanced about this idea of people being biased. So the next thing we want to look at is who stands behind this claim. So here we're looking at the larger organization or publication that this source is part of. So if it's an article in a newspaper, we're looking at, well, what is the newspaper it's in? If it's an article in a journal, what's the journal that it's in? If it's a YouTube video, well, what is this channel that the video is on, etc. So we want to look at, what's the publication procedure for this this source, right? How do they decide what kinds of material they're going to put out? What's their mission or agenda, right? What are they trying to do by putting this information out there? And what kind of vested interests might they have? And so there's a lot of different answers we might get to some of these. And one of the things that we often look for is peer review. We often talk about peer-reviewed sources being the best sources, kind of the gold standard of a good source. And peer review does give you a lot of confidence in a source being reliable. What peer review means is that the author wrote this thing, they submitted it to a scientific journal, then that journal anonymously sent it out to several other experts in that field and asked them for their feedback. And those experts gave their feedback. They may have said, this is a terrible article, don't publish it. They may have said, this is great, publish it. They probably said, this is a good article, but it needs X, Y, and Z fixed based on these peers' own expertise, their understanding of what we already know about this topic, their understanding of the correct methods for creating additional information, doing new studies and stuff, and they can evaluate this and say, well, this is great, but maybe we need to fix X, Y, and Z. Then it goes back to the original author. They get these peer reviews without knowing who said this, so it's all anonymous on both ends. They fix the problems that their peers identified or explain why those problems aren't actually problems. Resubmit it. It may go through several rounds of this. So if you find an article that's in a peer-reviewed source, then several other experts have also looked at this and signed off on it. So it's not infallible. There are things that are flat out wrong that have made it through peer review because those peers can't catch every different possible kind of mistake. Like if you just straight up fake your data, the peer reviewers probably aren't going to be able to catch that very easily. But it gives us some level of additional confidence. And to know whether a source is peer-reviewed, you just look at its main webpage. So either on the main webpage for the journal or in the About section, it will say if it's peer-reviewed, because being peer-reviewed gives it more authority, makes people trust it more. So a peer-reviewed journal is going to want to put that information out there. They're going to want to make that clear to you that they're peer-reviewed on their main page or in their About section. If you can't find a reference to it being peer-reviewed in there, then that means it's probably not. A last note here is that Google is not a source. I sometimes see people saying, well, I got this information from Google. You probably didn't get that information from Google. Google may have pointed you to that information from some other source. Right, Google is a search engine. It connects you to sources that are relevant to the query that you put in. Even if there's stuff that pops up on the Google search page, you sometimes get answers to questions above the actual links to results for your search. That information is just being pulled from those links. They're just trying to save you a click there. And they may or may not do a good job of pulling the right information there. So don't trust Google as your source. You can use Google to get to sources that you can then rely on for your information. And then the third important thing to ask is, when did they say it? You always want to check the date on any source that you're looking at. And there's not a simple, like, if it's this date or later, it's good. If it's earlier, it's bad, or something like that. No simple cutoff like that. But it's important to keep in mind that older information may be outdated. If you find an older source, there may be new information that supersedes what the old information said. There may be newer studies that have come out. There may be new data that we have access to now. The world may have changed since that source was written. So old information could be outdated, but on the other hand, new information may be unvetted. If there is something that is brand new, just being put out there for the first time, other people haven't had as much of a chance to look at it, to critique it, to suggest ways that there might be problems with this information, and to correct it. So being newer isn't necessarily better. How old and how new is good is going to depend a lot on the nature of the information that we're looking at. So let's do a case study. Let's see if we can put some of these ideas into practice. So I just popped onto Google News and went looking for opinion articles about wildfire. That's my area of expertise. And I just grabbed one of the first ones that came up. So this is not something that I picked out specifically because it was a particularly good or bad source. I just grabbed one of the top results on Google News, imagining that I was someone that was just, surfing around looking for information on different topics, didn't have any particular background. So I was just clicking on some of the first results that came up. And so the article we're going to look at here is from the East Oregonian, titled "Other Views. Are We Taking the Wrong Approach on Wildfires?" by Dominic De La Sala. And I'll share the link with this if you want to go and actually read the entire article for yourself. And, you can double check me and decide if you think I did a good job of evaluating this article. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is break down the claims that the article makes. And so the article makes a whole bunch of different claims, and I've pulled out 3 here as illustrations of these 3 kinds of claims that we can distinguish. So first I have here a social science claim. And so he's talking about a bill that has been introduced in Congress by Senator Jeff Merkley from Oregon. He says, Merkley's bill would allocate $30 billion to federal agencies for fuels reduction when they already are swimming in cash from the Infrastructure and Inflation Reduction Acts. So this is a social science claim because it's a claim about how human societies work, right? It's describing the contents of this bill in the Senate, and it's describing the consequences for agency budgets of these previous laws that had passed, right? The Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. And so if we were social scientists, and this was a social science class, we'd be maybe double checking that claim and seeing if he's accurately describing the bill, seeing if he's accurately describing the kind of money that these agencies have access to for fuel reduction because of these previous bills. We also have an ethical or political claim. He says, the only way out of this mess is to legislate drastic cuts in fossil fuels, ensure proper accounting of logging emissions, protect older forests from logging, and redirect the vast majority of spending to community fire preparation. So there he's making a claim about what we should do. Right? What's the right approach to take? And he's recommending a course of policy action there. So that makes that an ethical or political claim. It's telling us what we should do. And then third, I've got a physical science claim, which is what we're going to focus on in this lesson since we're in a physical science class, where he says we can now attribute at least half of the increases in acres burning since the 1980s to heat waves and droughts caused by emissions from burning fossil fuels and land uses like logging. So that's a physical science claim. He's talking about the way that the non-human world works. He's saying that because the climate has increased, therefore, we've had these increases in the amount of area being burned by forest fires. Okay, so the claim about the physical world, you make a physical science claim. Two things to note in this claim are first, the language of at least half. Right? That's kind of a vague wording there, right? At least half, that could be 50.001%, that could be 100%. Both of those are at least half. So we want to be careful when you have this kind of approximate, wishy-washy kind of language there. And another thing to note is that this half of the increase in areas burned, he's attributing to burning fossil fuels and land uses like logging, two very different things that are getting lumped together here. Right? We can imagine the effects of burning fossil fuels and the effects of logging on forests being potentially quite different, and they're being grouped together here in the same sentence. So two things to be cautious about, keep in mind as we're trying to evaluate whether this is an accurate claim. Okay, so we can look at the source that I was getting these claims from in the first place. So who is saying this? Author is Dominic Della Sala. And so if we look him up and we look for more information about him, luckily he's a famous enough person that we can find a good bit of information about him on the internet. According to his LinkedIn profile, he is the chief scientist at Wild Heritage, a project of the Earth Island Institute. And so we could look up what the Earth Island Institute is. It is a well-established environmental nonprofit. So we can tell from that what this organization's agenda is, right? They're an organization that is aimed at preserving the environment, promoting certain kinds of environmental policy. So as a person in a leadership position with this organization, we can imagine that Dr. Della Sala is trying to promote that island's the organization, the Earth Island Institute's agenda through writing this article for the East Oregonian. If we look into his own biography, he has a PhD in ecology from the University of Michigan, and he has published a whole bunch of scientific articles in peer-reviewed journals on topics related to conservation, climate, and wildfire. You can actually get his entire CV, his list of everything he's ever done, from his bio page at the Earth Island Institute. So we can check up on him. So he looks like he's a legit expert, right? He has a genuine background in ecology and climate science that would enable him to draw conclusions like the one that we're evaluating here. Then if we look at who stands behind it, the larger publication that we're working with, the East Oregonian, if we go to its About page, tells us since 1875, the East Oregonian has been Northeastern Oregon's largest regional newspaper. So this is a newspaper. I think this is not a scientific journal. It is a newspaper that's been around for almost a century and a half. So it's not a fly-by-night operation. Seems fairly well established. It's a regional newspaper, so it's not a big national or international paper like the New York Times or the Washington Post or something. It's focused on serving this small geographical area. We can imagine it probably has a much smaller staff than something like the New York Times. And then we can also check the political leaning of this newspaper. And, you could do that by hand by just reading through a whole lot of their articles and seeing where they lean. That will give you a more detailed answer, but also take a very long time. There are also websites that will rate the political leanings of websites and newspapers and so forth. So I looked the East Oregonian up on a site called allsides.com, and they rated it as politically centrist. So not to the left, not to the right. And it's important to note that centrist is not the same thing as unbiased. It's easy to see how a newspaper or a website or something that is politically far to the right or far to the left might be biased because of that. But centrism can be a bias as well. If you are committed to being centrist, then you'll tend to assume that the truth must be in between two extremes, even if one side actually has all the facts behind them and the other side is just, promoting a vested interest and doesn't have any good support, right? The middle is not necessarily correct or unbiased. So knowing that it's centrist is useful information, helps us contextualize what we're seeing here, helps us understand the audience that this was written for, doesn't necessarily mean unbiased. Then when did they say it? This article was published October 7th, 2023, which is actually today, the day that I'm recording this video. So this is a extremely brand new piece of information. That's why it was at the top of the Google News search results when I went looking for an example to use in the case studies. So this information is probably not outdated, but it also is very fresh and new source giving us this information. So let's see if we can find any other sources that will confirm or refute this natural science claim that we're looking at here, right? Which, again, I've got it on the next few slides just so that we can remember what we're looking at. So De La Salle claims we can now attribute at least half of the increases in acres burning since the 1980s to heat waves and droughts caused by emissions from burning fossil fuels and land uses like logging. So the first thing we might do is just Google climate change increased area burned and see if any of the results give us any sort of confirmation on this claim. And so the first result, when I Googled that, was from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So that is a U.S. government department that deals with atmospheric and climate kind of issues. And their page that came up says, climate change, including increased heat, extended drought, and a thirsty atmosphere, has been a key driver in increasing the risk and extent of wildfires in the western United States during the last 2 decades. So that statement from NOAA is consistent with what De La Salle says, right? It's giving us the same general idea that climate change is causing increases in wildfires. NOAA mentions Western United States, and De La Salle is writing in the East Oregonian newspaper, Oregon being out west. So that's consistent, and NOAA is a fairly reliable source as a major government department dedicated to providing that kind of scientific information for the American people. But this claim isn't exactly matching what was in the article, right? It's not exactly confirming the details of what De La Salle was saying. So we can keep digging. I mean, keep going through the search results. We can try to refine our search. We can add things like since the 1980s and attribution to try to pin down a source that will talk about exactly the thing that De La Salle was writing there. And after a little bit of poking around, I came across this article here by John T. Abatzoglu and A. Park Williams called Impact of Anthropogenic Climate Change on Wildfire Across Western U.S. Forests, published in 2016 in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And in that article, the authors say, we estimate that human-caused climate change contributed to an additional 4.2 million hectares of forest fire area during 1984 to 2015, nearly doubling the forest fire area expected in its absence. So that matches up much more closely with the claim from De La Salle's article. Right? We've got this statement about nearly doubling the forest fire area, looking just at climate change. And De La Salle's thing was combining climate change and logging together and saying it was at least half, right? So that's numerically consistent there with the amount of increased forest fire, and they were looking at the period from 1984 to 2015, and that was similar to the time period De La Salle was saying since the 1980s. So that's a pretty good match. So we can say that this article is pretty well supporting the claim from our original article. Now, is this article itself a reliable source? Well, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences is a highly respected, peer-reviewed journal. We can find some of that information on its own website. We can see that it's peer-reviewed there. We can see how often it gets cited by other scientists. So, the journal is a good one. And then if we look up those two authors, we find that Abetsoglou is currently researches and teaches at University of California, Merced, got his PhD at UC Irvine, and then Williams got his PhD at UC Santa Barbara, currently works at UCLA. So those are, certainly legitimate educational institutions, places we would expect to produce validated experts in various scientific topics. So, and if we look through their CVs, we can see they've got a lot of publications on this exact issue about climate change and wildfires. They've been both working on this topic for a while. So, they're definitely scientific experts. They're definitely people who know what they're talking about in this area. One other thing to note is that, like the NOAA source, they specify that they're talking about forests in the western United States specifically. Now, in the process of getting to that article, I came across another article that wasn't exactly on point, but gives some interesting additional context to this claim that we're seeing in the article by De La Salle and the similar claim being made in the Abetsoglou and Williams article. So this comes from an article by Aaron J. Hannon et al. There's a long list of co-authors on this one called How Climate Change and Fire Exclusion Drive Wildfire Regimes at Actionable Scales from 2021 in Ecological Research Letters. Or should be Environmental Research Letters. I mistyped that. So this article says, we conducted fire regime simulations using historical climate and fire exclusion scenarios across two watersheds in the inland northwestern United States, which occur at different positions along an aridity continuum. In one watershed, climate change was the key driver, increasing burn probability and the frequency of large fires. In the other, fire exclusion dominated in some locations. So here we're seeing a claim that climate change matters in some places, but not as much in others. So they looked at two different watersheds, and they said that in one, climate change made a big impact on the probability of fires happening, but in another one, because of different local circumstances, climate change was not as big of a driver. So this adds some nuance to this very broad scale claim made by the other authors about the overall impact of climate change on wildfire. And this is also a fairly reliable article. If we look up Erin J. Hannon, she got her PhD also from UC Santa Barbara and is currently at the University of Nevada, Reno. So she's also an expert in this, and Environmental Research Letters is a well-respected, peer-reviewed journal as well, just like Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So this source that I just happened to come across while searching for an exact match to the claim in the original article gives us some useful nuance and context to that very broad claim. So then our next steps would be, we could say, okay, this one physical science chain checks out. I think we can say that De La Salle was making a reliable statement there about the impact of climate change on the amount of fires, at least in the West. So then what about the other claims, right? There are a lot of other claims being made in this article. We could go through this process and check them all as well. And then the last thing to ask is, does the overall argument being made hold up? So even if you've got all of your individual claims correct, do they add up to a correct conclusion overall? So you want to fit those claims together, because you can make a wrong conclusion and support it with a bunch of correct facts. So you want to look at both the individual claims, are they correct, and how do they fit into the larger argument being made by your piece of media that you're evaluating.